Hello and welcome to this introduction into speculative design. I'm Theo, I'm a design sociologist, and I am the founder of Studio Hyperspace, the studio that is based on the principles of design sociology, and I am the co-founder and ambassador of Speculative Future Amsterdam, and that's a platform where we research the possibilities of speculative design. Before I dive into speculative design as an approach, I want to take you back to 5. In 1985, I was quite young, but this event, Live Aid, made a really big impression on me. It was an event to make sure that hunger would kind of be eradicated for once and for all. So the idea was to feed the world by throwing a festival with all the hotshots, all the big bands, like for example Queen, Led Zeppelin, Madonna, you name it. And they all said, okay, at the moment there is a famine in Africa, it's really horrible, let's kind of get rid of hunger for once and for all. And I, of course, watched this festival on television with millions of others around the world. And we all thought, okay, this is so big, this is so impressive, this will be the end of hunger in the world. Of course, it didn't. If you look, for example, at the figures of 2017, there was back then more hunger than there ever was in the world. Also more than in 1985. So it's interesting that we all want something and all say, okay, we are going to reach it, but in the end, we don't. It's the same with, for example, the Declaration of Human Rights. So in Article 4 it says that no man will be held as slave, and that's forbidden to keep slaves. And it's interesting because all the stuff, or most of the stuff that we use in the West is made by slaves or is made possible by slaves. For example, these people that work at Foxconn, they make the electronics that you use, for example your MacBook, or also your Dell computer or another computer. And they don't really like it there. They also try to commit suicide, but luckily Foxconn has this kind of nets so that people who want to commit suicide will fall into the nets. It's kind of a really terrible situation. And the same goes, for example, for these boys. They are really young, between 9 and 14. And they go into these mines to delve the stuff we need to make our electronic equipment. And they are also held as slaves. They have to work sometimes 16 or 17 hours a day. And they are held in camps. They can't go anywhere. So it's interesting that we on one hand have this document that says, okay, slavery is gone. Or we kind of make sure that there will be no slaves. And on the other hand, there are more slaves than ever at the moment. It's an interesting thing. One last example. We all think that we need to live in harmony with nature more, that we kind of in the last century had this kind of distinction between nature and culture, and that we kind of have to bridge that gap, and everybody thinks that's really important, but still we slaughter 3 billion animals for food each day. 3 million. I mean, let that sink in, how many animals that are. 3 billion a day. So I think, and there speculative design comes in, that one of the most important aspects is that we, as designers, but also as trend watchers, understand that we are stuck in a system that is based on written documents, for example, where we kind of write down that we don't want this thing anymore, but it doesn't kind of mean that we don't do that thing anymore, because there is a distinction between the doing and the thinking, and the writing and the actual kind of action to make sure that it won't happen again. And I think the metaphor that is used in this movie, which is by the way based on a comic book from 1984, a French comic book, graphic novel, is in this sense really interesting. This is a movie that is about, and it's kind of a little bit of a spoiler alert, about a society after an enormous kind of climate disaster that made the world unlivable because it was too cold. The only people that survived are in this train, and this train is already going circles around the world for 89 years. So all the people in this train are new. They haven't experienced the real Earth because they were born in this train. And then the interesting thing happens that they think that the train is their society, and that the train itself is the system that they have to operate in, and that there is nothing outside of the system. And I think that is one of the biggest mistakes that our Western world at the moment has, that we think that the system that we've created, that it is reality itself. So the document that says there will be no slavery is more real than reality itself, where there are more slaves than ever. And I think we need to change the situation drastically by get out of this train. The interesting thing is that designers more and more are aware of this fact. So more and more they are thinking about the long-term consequences of what they do. For example, this example, the man and also the team that built a retweet on Twitter. He really thought that that would be a good idea to let people kind of retweet opinions of others. But in fact, on the long term, that's approximately 11 years ago that they invented this. We have come up with a society and social media where everything is kind of politicized, that everything is kind of about the opinion, and that people attack each other about the opinions they have. It's interesting because I don't think that these designers really could kind of know that this world would happen. Because the design climate isn't like that, or wasn't like that back in 2000. But still, this designer says, okay, maybe I'm guilty because I handed a loaded gun to a 4-year-old. Strong metaphor, of course. And that's also, I think, the case with the invention of the eternal scroll, that makes us addictive to constantly be online because we think that the next thing we'll find in the scroll will be even better than the things we already found. I think with the invention of this, there wasn't kind of a idea to get people really hooked. I mean, okay, this is for the first time introduced on Instagram, and Instagram, of course, wants you to stay as long on the website as it is. But on the other hand, I was also kind of waiting for this. Because normally on a website, before 2010, you had to always click, do you want to see more results? Yes. And I thought, why the hell do we do this? Why can't we scroll through? So these designers had the same idea, introduced it, and now it leads to MOFO. FOMO. MOFO was something completely different. And also psychic problems, because people can't stop kind of using social media anymore. Already in the 1990s, Dick, a professor at a couple of business schools in the United States, came up with this model. A model where he said, okay, design is more than only the artifact, the thing that it creates. It's also much more than only the user that is going to use it, because that's kind of the main thing with user-centered design, of course. It's also the environment, the system, that it will eventually change under the influence of the design you make. And I think this is a really strong model. And it's kind of strange that we are still not using it. So the idea of user-centered design is kind of quite normal at the moment. It kind of got popularized in the 2000s, even later than this model. But the idea that you also need to think about the long-term consequence of what you do as a designer, that's still relatively new, and that's so strange. With speculative futures, we've kind of come up with the 3 M's. Because we like 3 more than 4, we came up with this model, where you think about the artifact, the behavior, and the transformation. And then, of course, the artifact is the service or product that you make. The behavior is not only what the user wants, but it's much more. It's also the impact that it has on an individual, on a user. And also the systems that it will change because it is introduced. Think, for example, of the smartphone. Well, yeah, just a product that you can use. But it eventually not only kind of changes our behavior, it also changes our whole social system, because we now think that we need to be online always. That we are also, for example, and that we need to take the internet with us when we go out on the streets. So that's a systems change. And it's kind of fueled by the invention of the smartphone, of course. And then there are the transformations. Those are not visible. You can't kind of walk into the streets and see those transformations. Well, we can kind of observe the behavior, and we can also see the artifacts. So this is quite difficult. But it is kind of the long-term effect that a design has. If we think about a smartphone, for example, there are a lot of kind of changes that we can't see. For example, what I already mentioned, the idea that you always need to be reachable, or the idea that what is said on social media is really important and that you have to give your opinion about it, for example. Those are kind of changes in society itself that also changes our values. So I don't think it's kind of a coincidence that with the rise of the internet and the idea of a network that kind of makes everybody kind of part of that network, is also exactly at the point that hierarchies are imploding, that we don't kind of have this confidence anymore into the government or into big companies, etc., that we more rely on ourselves or on the people that like us. So it is kind of a transformation that is fueled by the invention, of course, of the internet. Let's look at a couple of examples. So if you take the idea of Dick Buchanan and use it in the real world, then this would be design too. So this plastic soup isn't kind of an anomaly. It isn't something that is regrettably also an effect of using plastics. No, it is inherently to the design itself. So if you use plastic, you will get this, instead of that it is kind of something that, yeah, we didn't want this, but it happened. So this is a way of thinking that is much stronger than only thinking about the products and what it will do with people. Another example, traffic jams. So a traffic jam isn't something that just occurred because we invented a car. No, traffic jams are, in the idea of Dick Buchanan and also in the idea of a speculative design, an inherently design decision in the design of the car itself. If you choose to let people move in a box through the city, then you will eventually get this situation. Last one. If we as society decide, and that's also a design of course, that we find it really important to eat meat, and we have to get, of course, food for the animals to eat, and we get it from the Amazon forest, like this, then that decision, that design decision, is a part of the design itself. So if you design a society that is based on eating meat, then this is what you get. It's not kind of a thing that is kind of unfortunately there. No, it's a part of the design itself. And of course, I think you all figured it out. This is exactly what Marshall McLuhan also meant with the medium is a message. If we invent something, and according to McLuhan, of course, the medium is every kind of thing that we come up with, that we invent, that we build, that makes our senses stronger. So you could say that all the examples I gave are media in the sense of Marshall McLuhan. Then eventually we have to think about the message. What will that medium that we invented eventually do in society? How will it change society dramatically? Speculative design is, I think, really important to understand what is happening, but also do something about it. Because regular design methods, like for example design thinking, aren't really capable of addressing these kind of big problems, these transformations. So we need something different, something that is much more open. So according to Fiona Rabbi and Anthony Dunn in their 2013 book Speculative Everything, speculative design is much more a way to debate potential ethical, cultural, social and political implications of design itself. So according to them, design could be helpful to, for example, think about the future and design for the future and then have a debate about it. Do we want this future or do we want something else? Do we maybe have to change something to come up with that future? I think that's a really, really strong way of thinking. Although in this book, and the sheets are online, so I know you can't see everything now, but you can kind of see it in sheets. In this book, they are mostly kind of focused on the art world and the design world, which is kind of really abstract. So the results they had in the design sessions are only understandable for people that are already kind of familiar with working with art, for example. So we want to take it at Speculative Future Amsterdam, we want to take it further. And you can see that really good at that this future cone. So we are not really interested in the projected future, but we are much more interested in the possibilities that design has. So the things that are not really happening if we do nothing, and also the preferable. So what's your preferable future? What do you want as a designer? What is good for the world? And take that as a kind of starting point when you are designing. Speculative design is different. I already talked about this. If you compare it, for example, to design thinking, but also, for example, to future studies. So I think this diagram is really good because it kind of makes a distinction between, on one hand, incremental change. So change that kind of takes place in small steps. Two, on the other side, transformational change. Change that is radical, that changes reality in a really profound way. And on the other hand, you have design that is kind of based on a really normative structure. You have kind of values and norms, like for example, the social development goals by the United Nations, the Sustainable Development Goals. And on the other hand, you have kind of the situation that you come up with new values, that you think about the idea that if we have this system where we have certain values and the system doesn't function, then maybe those values are wrong. Maybe we need new values. And that's where speculative design comes in. So speculative design is focused on transformations, so really profound change, and on a non-normative attitude. So try and think in totally new values. So what should that values be if we have the chance to change the future? And eventually, of course, not only the future, but also the now, because there are also alternative nows at the moment where those new values are already kind of in place, but they are not the standard. An example, this is an electric car. And this is, of course, a step-by-step change because you aren't really changing a lot, but you take the car that is already there and has, of course, its flaws and change it a little bit to an electric car. So this is kind of an example of design thinking because it's really normative. It's about sustainability, which is really important, and the use of electricity instead of carbon fuel. And it's also incremental change because it is focused on a car that already exists. It's just kind of adding something to an artifact that is already there and is already kind of used in society itself. Another example would be this, moving sidewalk, invented, thought of in the early 1900s. a totally different way of movement instead of taking something that is already there. So I think this is a really good example of a thing that is much more kind of out there. And that's much more what speculative design is all about. Let's take a look at two examples of designers that I would consider to be speculative. First one, Frank Kolkman. Frank Kolkman at the moment works at Philips at the design department, and he is one of the leading designers there. In 2017, he won the Young Dutch Design Award with also this work. So this do-it-yourself surgical robot came about when Frank Kolkman was thinking about healthcare. So he read a lot of papers, and they all said, if we are going to have the healthcare that we have at the moment, then in a couple of years, maybe 5 years, maybe 15 years, more and more people aren't able to go to a hospital because hospitals will be too expensive for them. So he thought about it and came with this idea. What if I make a surgical robot, a do-it-yourself one that everybody can build with the equipment that is quite cheap, and then you can do your own surgery. Of course, this robot functions and it works, but you don't want to get surgery with it because it's quite unreliable. On the other hand, this shows that it is possible to maybe come up with your own methods of surgery. So it is a discussion piece. It says, okay, is this the future we want, where everybody is kind of using do-it-yourself surgical robots because they don't have money to go to the hospital? Fair point, and interesting project. Second one is Cow & Co. by Anastasia Eggers and Otto Neruda, both studying at that time at the Design Academy in Eindhoven, and they were thinking about the industrial farming and how cows are treated there to get their milk, for example. And they thought, okay, if we come up with an idea where the cow is the entrepreneur herself, so she doesn't need a farmer to sell her milk, she can do it herself. And that's kind of fair because it's her milk, it's not the milk of the farmer. So she can kind of also decide the place where she is. In this case, she's in the middle of the city, and you have an app and you can see where the cow is, and then you go to her and you buy her milk, and she gets the money. And it raises, of course, a lot of questions. On one hand, it's funny, it's maybe a little bit ironic. On the other hand, it also kind of makes you think about, okay, why didn't I think of the fact that a cow is a mother and she has a calf? Why do I kind of need her milk? And why have we this kind of strange system industrialized and objectified where cows are only used to get milk? On the other hand, you also think about the idea of, isn't it strange that we as humans think so much about entrepreneurship and about earning money? A cow is not really interested in this because she just gives milk. And wants to give the milk, of course, not to us, but to her calf. So it raises a lot of questions that can kind of fuel a debate or discussion about the future of how we treat animals. Also, I think, really strong project. So according to me, as lead of Speculative Future Amsterdam, I think that Speculative Future is value-driven. I think that's the main thing. And it needs to be introduced in the design process to make designers think in transformations instead of small kind of steps, small changes. And designers need to create new ecologies, new environments, and also new worlds where they kind of think about totally new behavior that is based on those new values and new artifacts, instead of coming up with things that are already there or are in line with the status quo already, because if they do that, nothing will eventually change. And I think you can also take this definition and make one image out of it. Well, maybe a moving image, and that's this. It says, go out of the train. You don't need to train. Go out of this train. Don't get stuck in this system. but see that there is something outside. And that, of course, is really in line with what we already talked about, the Baroque Sunbursts by Frederick Jameson. So as a designer, and especially a designer that is focused on speculative design, you always need to be open. You always need to see where those kind of rays of light from the sun kind of burst into your reality and makes you think in a different way about how the world also could function. And I think that's kind of the essence of speculative design. And that's what you are going to use in the project that you are going to do. Really important also is, because it's kind of also questioning the values that we have in society, that you, especially in the beginning, don't judge about things that are happening or what people think, also in your team. You also have to kind of set aside your own values, because maybe they are just in line with the status quo. And maybe you need to adapt new values to really understand what the world also could be. You also need to be open to explore alternative realities. And you are going to do this because one of the alternative realities are of course subcultures. And you are going to explore those subcultures and see if there are interesting aspects in those subcultures that you can use to come up with a transformational change. And don't think of problems or solutions. Just think in what you see, in which opportunities there are. So problems are, the word problem is a word that we are not going to use in this course. And of course, last but certainly not least, think outside of that train. For now, this is the introduction to speculative design. I hope you liked it. Answer the questions, and if you've done so, then you can move on to the short introduction into the speculative design approach we are going to use, intervention design. Have fun!